serves right. I think it's chapter 14, verse 22 is where we were. I think we had finished off the bottom column on my paper. So easy way to remember it. So chapter 14, if someone would, let's read verse 22 together.
Just verse 22?
Sure.
Do not go astray who devise evil, but mercy and truth belong to those who devise good.
What's the point that he's making here?
Our thoughts are important.
Now, those who devise good meet steadfast love and faithfulness, as some translations have it, and those who devise evil go astray.
Personal accountability is in that also. I'm responsible for deviating or not.
Mm-hmm. Personal responsibility is a big one. Sometimes, remember, a lot of these are little short sayings for you to remember in an opportune time. We'll get down to the one here in a few moments where he deals with a truthful witness saves lives. And that's an excellent one to have in your mind if have an opportunity or you're tempted to not be honest whenever giving your testimony. Remembering that it could save someone's life or it could condemn an innocent person. And so all of these don't all necessarily have a deep intrinsic meaning to them. Sometimes they're just exactly what they seem to be, but they're there to remind you and to kind of pique your memory whenever you're in that situation. And so if you're saying to yourself, well, I'm a faithful person, but I'm just devising this one evil thing, he kind of makes the point that you're going to go astray. Yeah.
What you said, I was thinking of a situation in our country. There's so many people devising evil right now. That's astray. The world would like to say that good is bad and bad is good, but it's the ones that devise evil that are going the wrong direction.
Yes.
Yeah,
he makes the point clearly, that the ends don't justify the means, and sometimes that's the phrases we use to justify. One devises this evil thing and hopes to accomplish a good purpose in the end, but that isn't how it works according to Solomon. He mentions in verse 23, he's kind of picked up this the last few chapters, the idea that if you kind of toil and you work hard, you get profit out of it. So he mentions that in all toil there is profit, but mere talk tends only to poverty. I don't know if sure you met a few of those people who they are full of talk of all the things they're going to do, all the things that they think are going to happen in the future, and then never actually act on any of those things. And so the general rule of thumb is that if you work, it's going to lead to some profit. It may not be a ton of profit, but if you try something, you're going to succeed a lot more than the person who just talks about doing something and never does anything. And again, one of those ones that just kind of should stick in our mind if we tend to find ourselves being people who talk and talk and talk and not actually do something. This is one of the Proverbs that should remind us to be people who actually act.
that's also very appropriate. You think, wow, this is how many 3,000 years ago, or how many years ago someone wrote this. But that's very apt for exactly right now, because we're in a situation where a lot of people there's payments being made to people that aren't working, and that gets very quickly, you can get accustomed to that and comfortable to receiving something for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, that can't continue forever, but the way to succeed and the way to move forward certainly is through labor.
Yeah.
Working hard, and almost anybody can do that, determined to do it, and when they do, they'll profit from it.
Yep, we live in a whole nation that was founded by people who came from almost nothing and determined to work hard and succeed. That is kind of more or less the American dream that still exists. And it's not just the American dream, that's pretty much anybody's dream. If you work hard, there is at least some profit in that, as opposed to just talking about it.
That person is physical and spiritual. Really, you think, if we labor here, there is profit for us spiritually, but if we just talk, we will be poor for eternity.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent point. Let's read verse 24.
Crown of the wise is their riches, but the foolishness of fools is folly.
So he kind of ties these two ideas together in verse 23 and verse 24. that if you toil hard, that's going to tend to be a sign of wisdom. There's a lot of people who claim to be wise and then don't really act on that. So he kind of puts these together that if the crown of the wise is their wealth. Same thing with those who toil, there is profit. But those who just talk, he kind of equates here in verse 24 with the folly of fools that just brings folly. It doesn't produce anything from it. There's no profit in it. And so, again, just one of those quick, easy statements that should stick in our mind that the folly of fools brings folly. Now, he had mentioned earlier on in chapter 14 about making a testimony, and that he's already mentioned that here. What does he say in verse 25 about being a witness? Saves lives. And he says that the one who breathes out lies is deceitful. It seems like that should just be common sense, and yet so many things that Solomon says seem like they should be common sense, but common sense is not always very common, ironically. And that's exactly what he makes the point here, is that, and consider what happens during Jesus' trial. You have a bunch of religious people who, most of them probably have most of Proverbs memorized, and yet you go back to chapter 2, he talks about those who lie in wait to shed innocent blood. You mentioned the testimony earlier on in chapter 14. He mentions again in chapter 14 that a truthful witness saves lives, while the one who breathes out lies is deceitful. And yet, they search and they try to find two people who can lie close enough to one another to get a testimony of a charge of 2 or 3 witnesses to crucify Jesus. All of them go by night to arrest him, to take him to a kangaroo court in the middle of the night. It seems like they should have known better, or it would have clicked in their minds. And yet the deceitfulness of sin is deceitful. And they deceive themselves into believing that they were producing something good while devising evil. And Solomon kind of points that out 1,000 years before that even comes up in Jesus' case. And then he has 2 verses, verse 26 and verse, go ahead.
And then, in chapter 6, the 6th thing, when you talk about abominations, to me, that all my life, even when you didn't really understand what an abomination was, it's certainly something that sounds bad, and it is bad, and it's one of the things God hates, and this is one of those as well, in Proverbs 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
False witness who speaks lies.
Mm-hmm.
Ask something about verse 24.
Sure. I won't be able to answer, but you're welcome to ask.
Or you or me or anyone, who's the wise in verse 24? Is that worldly wisdom and a wealthy man considers himself wise? Or is this the wisdom and the continuing thought of one who doesn't devise evil, or the one who labors in profit, and we're speaking of spiritual wisdom, that his crown is his riches? Because a worldly minded person will read that. The richest people in the world are obviously wise, so the riches, that's the crown of the wisdom. Is he talking that, or is he talking the wisdom of one who's faithful to God? Is the crown of the wisdom of the person who's faithful to God, that's your riches?
It's a good question. Solomon does deal a lot here with physicality throughout the Proverbs. That if you work hard, you won't go hungry. If you desire the right thing, God will bless you. He kind of plays his own advocate as you get over, or his own devil's advocate as you go over Ecclesiastes, and he points out all these things that are ideal in Proverbs. This is how it should work out. Then he wrestles with why it doesn't always work out that way in Ecclesiastes. And I think to some degree, since he's been working on this theme throughout chapter 14, that if you work hard, there is success for you. If you get up early and you toil, then you're going to have enough bread. And it seems to be, given what he says in verse 23 and verse 24, that there is an application for physical wealth.
This is the wise person that physically labors.
Mm-hmm. But I think that, as most Proverbs, there is probably a secondary application that also applies to spiritual wisdom and spiritual wealth. Where Paul says that there is, laid up for me a crown.
That's
Over.
kind of the thought that I had when I reread that. I'm like, which direction is he talking with this?
It's one of the neat things about Proverbs, it could be both.
My Bible has a footnote for Proverbs 10:22. And it says, "The blessing of the Lord it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it." So that maybe goes into that spiritual piece that you were talking about.
We certainly know that's the real riches we're looking for anyway as Christians. Riches are pretty close treasures of heaven. What moth and rust doesn't destroy, and so certainly we know that that's the real wisdom we're looking for. And that's the wisdom that the book starts out about. The real wisdom is knowledge of God.
Mhm.
I think Chad made a good point, looking back at verse 23, that was more so towards physical. In this context.
Solomon seems to be kind of driving in that point through the last two chapters of labor equaling, some type of wisdom or some type of gain from God or favor with him. That seems to be kind of his main theme. While there is additional application, I would probably say he's dealing here with a physical labor, physical wealth. He does get into more spiritual matters in verse 26 and 27. Two times he'll mention the fear of the Lord back to back. So verse 26, "In the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence, and his children will have a refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death." And so two things he has kind of to talk about the fear of the Lord. What is the confidence that we have, the strong confidence that we have in verse 26?
Confidence of salvation.
Yeah. Not just salvation, but consider if Solomon, consider the audience, primary audience, is going to be the Jews. So the command was given over in Deuteronomy: you keep the law, you get all the blessings. If you obey my commands, you have safety. One of the neat ones over in Exodus, right towards the second half of Exodus, God mentions that 3 feasts you'll have, and 3 times a year all the men need to present themselves to the tabernacle, which eventually is going to be at Shiloh and then later on in Jerusalem. But 3 times a year, every man in the whole nation, 20 years and older, has to leave their home and go towards the tabernacle for the feasts. And then he promises them that during that time, no nations around you will covet your land. That he's going to stop them from coveting the land so that when all the men are gone, there isn't raids going on. It's one of those things that, from my viewpoint, I never would have thought of it. I never would have thought, because I'm living 21st century America, I don't have to leave anywhere and travel for 3 weeks to go to a feast. I don't have to leave my wife and children or my home exposed right on the border of Moab. I don't have to be there waiting for the raids to happen. Though if I leave tomorrow, my neighbors will be looking over my fence saying, "Okay, Chad's going to be gone for 3 weeks to the temple. This is the time to strike." Never would occur to me. But obviously that would have been a big priority to them. And God says, "I'll make sure it doesn't happen if you obey my commands." And there's a whole host of those things that God promises in the Old Testament. That if you fear the Lord, you have a strong confidence in salvation and protection, continue to supply all the needs that are there. And then what does he say in verse 26 also, you guys? So you have a strong confidence, and there's an additional thing. It's for the children, that they have a refuge. You look at all the Psalms all the Psalms that David writes. The Lord is my refuge, the Lord is my strong tower. I will rest in the shelter of his wings. All the language that he uses poetically. That if you have a strong confidence, what happens to your children? They also have that. He mentions that he will continue to bless the children and the children's children down to the 3rd generation. That to those who love me. There's an inheritance that is carried on, even if people are not inherently righteous. If I don't teach my children to love God, but I teach them to be a pretty good person, there's still some secondary blessings that go along with that. And we see that with Israel, that you have, while they don't always do a great job of teaching the next generation is still not terrible yet. And then you have the 3rd generation that's starting to lose some of that morality. How about verse 27? The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. And obviously, the Jews had some idea of Sheol. I don't know if they had a fully formed idea of what all of that entailed. You start to get a little more information during the time of Daniel. Daniel kind of fleshes out some of the ideas of afterlife. But there's this understanding that if you fear God, there is an eternal security that goes along with that. And if you turn away from the fear of the Lord, what's waiting for you? Yeah, the snares of death. Yeah. It's hard to go through some of the prophets and recognize that these are hard times for the nation of Israel. Where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we look at them as great heroes of faith and do amazing things, and sometimes forget that they were a select few who were saved, and vast droves of their fellow countrymen were killed and slaughtered. Recognizing that they are the small elite who made it, as opposed to the vast majority who turned away from the fear of the Lord and ensnared death. And so you have those stark contrasts during some of those time periods where you see Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, we can't eat this food because we fear God. And then God prepares his tools, and then he puts them to work in his kingdom. As opposed to the whole rest of the other people who continually turn away from God, and their entire nation is destroyed just a few years later. So you see some real applications to that throughout the Jewish history.